So we'll start with a question to the entire panel. When you all look at healthcare AI today, what are your highest conviction investment theses? The areas where there's still real opportunity and where startups, not incumbents, have a real defensible right to win. We'll start with you, Caitlin.
Thank you so much for having us, John. This has been such a wonderful conference, and thinking through just the immense opportunity that exists now that AI exists, I think is really exciting. The way that I think about the right investments to make or places to bet on is really thinking about what should our ecosystem look like now that AI exists if you were to redraw it with a blank sheet of paper. And the reason I think it's important to have that end in mind is one of the wonderful things about AI, we just saw this with Lovable in that example you gave, is that the cost of software development is coming down so much that the obvious low-hanging fruit should sort of just happen like that. And where we should see that real lasting innovation is companies that use not only technology, but have business model innovation that works to really make our ecosystem work more smoothly together and take cost out of the system while preserving clinical quality.
Terrific, Annie.
So,
Microphone.
yeah, let's start with this. How's that? Is that good?
Amazing.
All right. So it's interesting because we do healthcare and fintech, okay? And it's interesting because fintech has always led in terms of technology, and we always were happy to be in it because in healthcare it would come 10 years after we were investing in these things in fintech. And I think what's exciting now is that healthcare is actually leading. So if you think of fintech before, basically it was mandated interoperability, and you had apps. I mean, you had companies like Plaid that were actually created, in order to actually enable fintech apps. And I think what we're excited about and seeing now is that healthcare is actually leading. We're seeing many more opportunities in healthcare than fintech with AI. And we're just beginning to see it evolve. And I think in part because so much unstructured data, in part because the healthcare system is so screwed up, because we're so far behind in technology, because the good work, that David has done and others and EHRs is really, now we've invested a ton, providers invested a ton in sort of the framework that we can now work with, but now they can also move on to actually invest in other, in other ways and in workflow. And I think it's the first time in healthcare that we're actually not putting burden on providers, but taking burden off. And I think that's the most exciting thing, is that it is actually a way to increase the satisfaction of providers as well as their efficiency and their, ultimately quality. I think what's I was just with the head of enterprise at OpenAI, and I think the fascinating thing is he's seeing what we're seeing, not surprisingly, in that we mapped, there are 800 healthcare AI companies that have been created in the last 3 years. And 90% of those are for providers and for drug development, drug discovery. And most of the activity is in fact, in terms of number of companies, is in the provider world. I mean, we hadn't done really serious provider software since Athena Health, So, and now in the last 3 years, Ambience and Regard and a number of other companies, like a huge opportunity for these companies. And in drug discovery is just beginning, and I think what's going to happen there is there'll be such concentration with the winners that there aren't going to be hundreds of great companies that scale, I don't think, in drug discovery. And in part because it's a huge bet by pharma, and you don't know until a product is in a human as to whether a model actually works. And so there has to be a lot of trust in the firm that's creating the models. And I guess the interesting thing to me is we have done a lot of investing around payers in the past, software, services, payer tech that's been enabled. And I think obviously health plans are a little challenged right now. But I think the fascinating thing to me is that we have literally not seen a credible company that's selling AI software into payers. And so I do think there'll be an incredible opportunity there, but they're going to sort of have to get out of their own heads about creating some of these things internally And you're probably not going to work with a foundational model company and actually be wildly successful creating your own internal software. So I think there will be an opportunity there.
No, I do agree with that. I think we're certainly still in early innings on the provider side, but earlier on the payer and pharma outside of drug discovery. Given the audience, maybe I'll focus on the provider angle. Earlier today, there was a slide that showed, I think it was administrative efficiency and clinical productivity is really 1 and 2 on CEOs' minds. And that is where we're seeing certainly the most opportunity. On the administrative efficiency side, especially provider, right, front office, mid office, back office. The front office space is particularly interesting right now in terms of it's not just efficiency in terms of staffing, but you can intake more patients, reduce denial, so there's a revenue opportunity as well. And then you can potentially go mid to back. And then on the clinical productivity side, there's all this conversation around, will AI replace doctors? When will it? How do you do regulatory reimbursement? And so looking really for teams that are embedding clinical AI as part of that care team, just as you would have a nurse practitioner or a resident or another part of the care team. And in areas where there's great supply-demand mismatch, right? If you think about mental health or primary care or all these areas where we need more care team members to service the need. So very interested in areas there. And then the third, I would say, is kind of comes to the business model question, which is, do you really need to be or want to be the technology in all of these areas? And I think in some cases, it might be better to be the service provider who owns the customer relationship and the data. And for that, we're exploring what are called AI roll-ups, where you'll acquire an existing service provider and disrupt from within with an AI native team, and then continue to acquire onto that platform. So looking in those 3 areas, specifically on the provider side.
So just expanding on that, Brenton, let's stick with you for this next question. So it's seeming to be increasingly clear where a lot of the incumbents, particularly hyperscalers, EMR companies, et cetera, are going to try to compete and win versus startups. But where I think there's a lot of uncertainty still is where the foundation model players are going to come into play in all of this, all these different equations that are still open-ended. You're all a large investor in Anthropic. I know you spent a lot of time with the Anthropic team. Where do you see the foundation model players playing directly in this whole ecosystem? And how do you think that impacts where the most attractive places to start health tech startups is?
No, that's a great question. And yeah, Anthropic's obviously a large investment for us, but also Mistral, XAI, and others there too. So they're all taking different approaches. I think you have to take a step back and realize the foundational model what it takes to make is often very, very smart PhDs in a lab creating frontier models. Those folks often are not the folks who are in a workflow on site at a health system or a payer, designing UX, UI, and things of that nature. So I think it's important to realize that difference. Of course, if you look at OpenAI, they've now hired the former head of product at Instagram and Doximity's co-founder, so they can certainly add to that lab capability to try to go fuller stack. But at its core, these are kind of lab frontier research organizations. The other piece is, they're very much the infrastructure upon which all of these applications are built. And so continuing to focus there. And if you're an application layer company, the adage is you should be building for where the models will be a year or 2 from now. Because frankly, the models in the lab right now are more advanced than what's available. And then what's coming out will just continue to improve. And so, building your own model might be a little risky given that. But if you're building an orchestrator that relies on, the models getting better, that's fairly defensible over time. If you're then embedded with workflow, UI, and then so the last piece is, some people say there really aren't moats anymore except speed. And so, of course, in this early phase where there's a land grab opportunity, it's kind of, can you be focused and have the trust of your customers and go in there and then and move that way. So that's some of the stuff. And it sounds like Annie was with OpenAI yesterday. She might have some additions on that.
Any additions, Annie? Brenton teed that one up too good. Not to
No,
ask.
he did. I guess I'd only say that I think they are very focused on drug discovery, and they're developing models specifically for that. And I think they will compete directly with the isomorphics and others of the world, and and think of the models where you're getting a royalty or payment for success. And they obviously. Maybe they do need cash. They would say they don't need cash, but given the amount of cash they're burning, yeah, they probably
all
do.
need cash.
We all need cash. But so I think that's really where their focus is, and I think they will be, at some level, a competitor with open evidence. They're already working on that. They're working on that with ambience too. But I do think, while they want to eat the world themselves, that I think that they do understand that getting into vertical, and then the provider world is a whole different kettle of fish.
So sticking with you, Annie, you mentioned in the first question that Oak HCFT, and this is my words, not yours, has been a trailblazer in both health tech and fintech for many, many years. Fintech obviously matured in a much more digitally native environment than healthcare has. As healthcare is now catching up and the technology is catching up, how's that influencing where you're placing bets and where you think the most exciting opportunities are?
Yeah, I would say it only. In the past has influenced us in terms of technology. I think now we're actually feeling like healthcare is ahead of fintech in terms of the use of Gen AI, and so I do think we're learning in fintech from healthcare, and so it's actually the inverse. I mean, I would love to think the consumerization side would be developed. Obviously, it happened in fintech sooner, but I think in healthcare, as we all know, it's going to happen in different ways. And we're seeing now consumer companies like MIDI and others, Hims, Hers. It's actually going to be interesting to see whether the advertising world's changing on TV is going to change that equation at all. But with the new administration's approach, but I do think that there is consumerization coming into healthcare, but it is going to be worried. Well, GLP-1s, those with resources, it doesn't solve the problems that we want to solve, because I do think we are consumers when we're well and we're patients when we're sick. And I think it's a very different motion as consumers in healthcare.
Caitlin, on to you. So GC, like Lightspeed, is a large industry-agnostic, multi-stage investment firm. But GC's gone further than almost any other investor with its health assurance vision. You've raised dedicated funds, you've partnered with health systems, you recently acquired a health system in Summa. From that vantage point, what convinces you that a startup can take an opportunity area and drive real system-level transformation?
So just to take one step back to sort of describe what GC's health assurance vision is to everyone, candidly, I think it's a lot of the reason we're all collectively here today, where we really believe in making healthcare more accessible, preventable, and affordable. And so many of the themes that others have talked about today is why we've made some of the choices that we have as a company, where to make transformation happen, you need to have the best ideas, which are often from folks that are not jaded by how, as Annie said, tricky and messed up our healthcare system is. You need to have willing partners that want to transform together. And I think the way to make that happen at scale is to bring those groups together, where our job is to find the best founders, the best ideas, the best technology that we think has the best shot at actually working, and then have an environment where folks have raised their hand to say, I would like to transform, bring me the best ideas, I can bring resources as well. And then to your point on, do you just partner, or do you have a laboratory where you can make this happen? For those that don't know me, I'm an investor now, but I was an operator for the past 12 years. And the way to get anything done is always change management. Especially if you're going for the biggest vision, you need to really not just have an idea and sort of a place to distribute it, but real buy-in and cultural buy-in that allows you to transform over time. And coming back to sort of where the best ideas in AI are, I think there's obvious low-hanging fruit that all of us can and should be doing. But to really recreate the system from the inside out, having that full laboratory where you're willing to put in the time and effort behind not just the idea and distribution, but the really tactical change management is quite important.
So on to our next segment. That was incredibly helpful. Once you've identified the right opportunity, the next big step is all around execution. Healthcare demands a lot of proof, more than many other industries. You need clinical validation, workflow integration, and measurable outcomes. But the speed and the clock of venture capital moves at a different pace. It can be every 12 to 18 months you need to raise money. As you think about that tension for founders in this space, that'll be most of the topics that we run through right now. Where you can move more quickly and where you want to continue to be responsible, generate a lot of proof, and move slowly. So Brenton, you've run the gamut over the course of your career. You've been a physician, you've been an operator, you've been an early stage investor, and now you're a growth stage investor. What are the biggest mistakes that you see early teams making in health tech as they balance that need for speed with the pressure for rapid growth? And where are there places where you think healthcare founders over-validate relative to what's actually necessary to be able to make the next steps in their corporate trajectory?
That's a great question. I think to start off, it's healthy that, again, we have a bunch of health systems in here, that there is this pressure applied to proof, right? So it's very hard to move fast and break things when you're selling into health system because they have such great scale and sophistication that it requires proof points. And so there's a natural iterative evidence development to get through scale typically. And then on the early stage side and the late stage side, there's obviously, when you want venture scale outcomes, you want the biggest TAM and the largest pools, and those are the largest customers. But if you're starting early, you often can't just start there, right? It's this chicken and egg. And so often teams will, go through a 2 to 3 year, which is too long, with runway sales cycle into a national payer, because that's the ultimate end goal, versus can you start with smaller regional or community health plans? Can you start direct to consumer, go one by one, and gradually, iteratively learn? And then with that scale, then get pulled towards health systems now that you're already working with hundreds of thousands, if not up to 1 million patients. And so doing that sequencing, I think, is really critical. And then I'd say there's two other extremes, which is there's those that actually just grow insanely fast. I think Abridge, Open Evidence are examples of that. And that's where you just have a jaw-dropping experience for the user, and there's almost this bottoms-up utilization. And that's proof in itself if you're having users that are just that voracious for your product. And on the other end, often when there's more clinical diagnosis or treatment, and now the FDA is regulating you, that clinical proof is just extraordinary. And I think sadly, at least in the prior generation of companies with digital therapeutics, that kind of lost the plot because there's so much validation and trials that thoughts around reimbursement, user experience were kind of secondary. And so once those were proven clinically valid, they didn't actually work in a business or real world setting. So those are a few of the different continuums, and it depends by company and by product.
So Annie, Oak has backed some of the biggest breakthrough successes in the industry over the last few decades. CareBridge, Athena, VillageMD, One Medical, Devoted, so many huge successes that have driven great outcomes for patients and for investors. When you see a company that's in a long validation cycle, what gives you conviction that they're going to survive it? What are those early proof points and signals that you think are demonstrative of a company's ability to actually survive and break through?
Well, I mean, it always starts with belief in management, so that's just fundamental. But I think it's that win-win-win. Like, they're providing great value to the customer, and that customer could be the person that's using the product as well as the enterprise itself. But it's also a win for the system, right? We're lowering costs, we're increasing quality. I mean, those things have to exist in the product market fit, and then the win, for all of us is also the economics of it. The unit economics have to work. It has to be profitable. So, I mean, assuming you have those sort of fundamentals in place, it really goes down to one of sort of my early CEOs of a healthcare software company said, and we would have constant fights in the boardroom because when you get to the KPIs, there was always this like revenue, EBITDA, customer satisfaction. He only wanted customer satisfaction. He didn't care about anything else. It was like, how happy are my customers? And it's really fascinating because I think he was dead right, like absolutely right. Because at the end of the day, the word of mouth, the satisfaction of those customers that just continue to buy and buy more, it was just, he created value. Like that company created value. And so I think it is just like, if the customer loves you and you have an economic model that works, that's the durability of the model. Yeah.
Caitlin, you mentioned earlier that you bring an operator's lens to all the different investment work you're doing now. You've built businesses in home health, post-acute care, transportation, before returning to the investment world. How does that operator's lens shape how you think about AI startups in particular? And can you give any examples of where operational feasibility or lack thereof has influenced decisions you've made on whether or not to pursue different investments?
Oh, that is a great question. And honestly, we'll play off a lot of the themes that Brenton and Annie just said, where one, the team really matters, and two, it is all about practicality and having that big vision, but the pragmatism to pull it off. The way that I describe that in a little bit more detail, there's probably three things that really matter. One is our system is so complicated that even the obvious incentives at the highest level aren't really what drives buying decision making. And you have to really understand the micro incentives of, okay, a payer cares about reducing MLR, but am I selling to the quality team that's working out of the administrative budget, or the product team that actually really just cares about gaining membership while reducing MLR? They make very different decisions on the same product, and understanding how they'll interplay with each other, what really matters to them, will really drive your ability to be successful. Sort of to Brenton's point on, you have to have a reimbursement plan. The second is, I think that founders need to have a level of humility. I used to work at Uber. I ran Uber Health, and when I got there, we were a specialty benefit manager. We were managing transportation, eventually prescription delivery, grocery, and over-the-counter benefits. And when I got there, we had no way to submit a claim. There was a level of hubris that assumed that because it didn't make sense and there was an easier way, that an incumbent industry would bend to our will, and that's just not practical. And so finding those founders that have the level of humility to get that real customer feedback of, I know this is the way it should work, but here's how it does work, matters quite a bit. And then the third thing is, man, is it hard to be a founder, because not only do you have to run your business, but you have to fundraise, and you have the benefit of having a great idea, typically great technology, but you don't necessarily have the benefit of time. And so having that practical thinking about, here's my big vision, here's the bar I have to hit to make sure that I get another bite at the apple, and here's how I'm going to run my roadmap to make sure I'm seeing the future, to make it easier and easier over time, I think are those three things that both make a great business and then make a team that I'd want to bet on.
So on to our final segment. So you've identified the opportunity, you've navigated the proof cycle. The big question always becomes, can companies achieve real system-level transformation, or do they stay as point solutions? Historically, most have remained point solutions that are subscale. But for a lot of the reasons we've talked about, many people are saying this moment could be different. And in this segment, we'll explore what it really takes to achieve that level of breakout success. So Brenton, Lightspeed led the Series C for Bridge, which, as we've said earlier, is one of the hottest health tech companies in the world right now. When you made that investment, many questioned it and whether or not it still had enough room left to run at that point. In the 18 months since, the company has been a huge breakout success. It's raised 2 additional rounds of financing. What do you think is the biggest driver of that success, and what does it teach us about what the playbook is going to be going forward for Gen AI startups selling to providers?
I think I saw Shiv on the agenda originally, so I was hoping
He
could
had
have
an
handled
important
this
meeting
one.
to go to. It was going to be a great session.
I'll give it a try, but you know, there's different viewpoints on it, and I think it all converge in where I believe. But you know, some would say, or you could say, is it that Shiv, as a physician, had such a deep understanding of the user and such a deep CMIO network and trust that he was able to kind of get this off the ground? Was it the technology being, really cutting edge? Was it Kaiser as a lighthouse customer? Was it deep Epic integration and other EHR integrations? And is it now the fact that it is not just a feature or a product and clinical conversation, but getting into billing and that platform-wide stuff? So maybe one of those. Especially as someone who loves early stage investing, always orient around the person. And I think we can often get distracted with AI. Just it's all around us now, and there's so many AI applications and companies and ideas. And it really still comes down to the people behind the AI. And so if you think about some of those moves I just mentioned, very strategic, very hard to pull off, you needed all of those, and I think you needed the team at a bridge, or like a team at a bridge, to actually pull that off. And so that's I think where it ultimately comes down to.
So Annie, you've had one of the broadest apertures in terms of what it takes to build a hyperscale company, and you mentioned some of the defining criteria for the last generation of companies Oak had invested in. Is this moment different, and do you think those defining criteria will be different in this next stage of companies, just given all the changes we've described?
Yeah, I mean, as Brenton said, it is the same in terms of it is all about people and talent, and that will never change in entrepreneurship and making a successful company. But I think there are some different things. I think if I go back to the companies that really distinguish themselves and are still durable, great companies, they were early. They were unique, and they didn't have 10 competitors. They saw something before others did. They invested in it. They committed to it, and they succeeded. And they had the time and luxury to sort of figure it out. I think what's very different now is that there is no time and luxury. There are almost in every opportunity 5 or 10 companies being funded, and you need to move very quickly. I think the level of tech talent needs to be higher. It definitely needs to be higher than in the past. So I think you win in part because of that tech talent. And so it's obviously the CEO, but also that combination of tech talent that healthcare sort of had the luxury in the past to be sort of somewhat mediocre. In software, no luxury there, and we have to be really good. And I think the other thing is just an execution it has to be also excellent. And I do think even for the great companies in the past, sometimes you were wandering in the dark to get there, and now it's like there's no wandering. Like you better get there because somebody's going to beat you to it. And so I do think that execution, tech talent, teams just have to be that much better.
So Caitlin, last question before we go into a very quick lightning round with all of you. GC redefined itself earlier this year from a venture capital firm to a global investment and transformation company. And one novel pillar of that, which Brenton also alluded to earlier, is an acquisition-driven strategy where you acquire legacy assets with strong distribution, roll them up, dramatically transform them with AI. How do you envision that actually working in practice, and how does it fit into your broader thesis on system-level transformation?
Yeah, I think if you're going to transform a system, you have to think about what are all the levers do you need to be able to pull it off. And I think we've spent a lot of time talking about how the technology is just better than it's ever been, which has also led to a crowding of the space. And so how do you set up a team for success to not just, as Andy said, wander through the dark once you've proven that their model really works, they can execute, et cetera? And I think there's a really interesting opportunity to sort of acquire your own distribution, to give them that leg up on here's some contracts, here's an existing tech stack that you can make much better by applying AI. And what's great about that is, one, the math tends to work, right? Just because the legacy software versus the new technology, you tend to be able to make a financial return to justify that acquisition as a standalone. And then second, I talked a lot about before, I really firmly believe that change management in general is going to be the thing that we all need to collectively invest in to be able to pull some of this off. And change management is a whole lot easier when you own the assets versus have to have indirect influence. And so I think this strategy is also important, not just from a financial return standpoint, but from the ability to control your own destiny and make sure that the best in class technology, business model, et cetera, has a platform to be adopted on.
So this has been a really great discussion. We've covered a lot of ground: opportunity selection, execution, the path to scale. In this last 2 minutes or so, I want to do a quick lightning round. So I'm going to throw out a handful of different themes, and from there I'll ask for a 1 or 2 word answer from each of you. Overhyped, underhyped, appropriately hyped, both from the perspective of impact and investments. So let's start with Brenton, foundation models in healthcare.
Underhyped.
Annie?
Underhyped.
I'd say appropriately hyped.
Okay. AI-enabled clinical documentation.
Appropriate.
Appropriate. I'm just going to say what he says.
I'm going to say underhyped.
Okay. AI and drug discovery.
Appropriate.
Overhyped.
Overhyped.
Okay. Value-based care 2.0.
Underhyped.
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 For all the entrepreneurs in the room, could be an opportunity. Rural data.
Appropriate.
Yeah. Appropriate.
Appropriate.
Okay. And final one, autonomous clinical decision support.
Underhyped.
Appropriate.
Also appropriate.
Please join me in thanking our panelists. This is a great discussion.